The air is thick with screams and steel. Out of the chaos, a giant figure surges forward, bare-chested, eyes blazing, shield clamped in his teeth. Arrows pierce his skin, but he doesn't falter. Enemies recoil in horror. Who nor what was this creature? A fearless Viking blessed by Odin, or a broken man consumed by trauma and madness? Few figures from the Viking Age capture our imagination, quite like the berserker. These legendary warriors have become synonymous with uncontrollable battle rage, superhuman strength, and a terrifying disregard for personal safety. In popular culture, they appear as the ultimate Viking warriors, men who could transform themselves into something beyond human, immune to pain and fear. But behind the myths and legends lies a more complex truth. Were berserkers truly the divinely inspired warriors of Norse sagas, blessed by Odin with supernatural abilities? Or were they men traumatized by the horrors of Dark Age warfare, whose apparent fearlessness masked profound psychological damage? Perhaps most intriguingly, could they have been both? This exploration takes us deep into the fog of history, where fact and fiction blur. We'll examine the literary accounts that have shaped our understanding of berserkers, the scant archaeological evidence for their existence, and the psychological theories that might explain their legendary behaviour. Along the way, we'll consider how modern understanding of combat trauma might illuminate one of history's most enduring warrior archetypes. The warrior's body trembles, not with fear but with something primal and electric. His companions back away as foam gathers at the corners of his mouth. A low growl builds in his chest, not the sound of a man but of something wild. The transformation has begun. Is this divine possession, or the mind fracturing under pressure? The word berserk has entered our modern lexicon as a term for wild, uncontrolled behaviour. But its origins lie in Old Norse language and culture. The term berserker, Old Norse berserker, plural berserker, likely derives from a combination of bear, and shirt or coat, circa, suggesting bare-shirted or bare-coated warriors. Some scholars alternatively propose the first element might come from bear, meaning bear, indicating warriors who fought without armour. Our primary sources for berserkers come from medieval Icelandic literature, particularly the sagas written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, though they describe events purported to have occurred centuries earlier. These accounts paint a vivid, if sometimes contradictory, picture of berserker behaviour and abilities. In Ynglinga saga, part of Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, written around 1230 CE, we find perhaps the most famous description. Odin's men went without mail coats and were mad as dogs or wolves. They bit their shields and were as strong as bears or bulls. They killed men, but neither fire nor iron could hurt them. This is called berserker rage. The Eyrbyggja saga describes berserkers as men who went without armour and acted like mad dogs and wolves. They howled like wild animals. In Egil's saga, we learn that berserker rage, berserksganga, would come over warriors, granting them superhuman strength while making them impervious to fire and weapons. These literary accounts share several consistent elements that form our classic image of the berserker: transformation. Berserkers underwent a visible change before battle, trembling, shivering, and sometimes foaming at the mouth. Animal association. They were frequently associated with bears and wolves, sometimes wearing the pelts of these animals, and were described as taking on animal-like qualities. Invulnerability. They were said to be impervious to fire and iron, weapons, continuing to fight despite wounds that would incapacitate ordinary men. Superhuman strength. During their battle frenzy, berserkers displayed strength far beyond normal human capacity. Loss of human restraint. They bit their shields, howled like animals, and fought with a complete disregard for personal safety. Post-frenzy weakness. After the battle rage subsided, berserkers often experienced a period of significant weakness, lasting several days. In the sagas, berserkers appear in various roles. Sometimes they serve as elite warriors in a king's retinue, as with King Harald Fairhair's berserkers in Heimskringla. Other times they appear as antagonists, roving troublemakers who challenge men to duels and take their property, and women if victorious. By the later saga age, berserkers had increasingly negative connotations, often portrayed as bullies and villains rather than noble warriors. The Vatnsdæla saga tells of a berserker named Thorir who demands a farmer's daughter in marriage. When the hero Thorkel confronts him, Thorir began to howl and to bite the rim of his shield. Thorkel ultimately tricks and kills Thorir, presenting berserker rage as something that could be manipulated by a clever opponent. These literary depictions raise fascinating questions. Were berserkers truly believed to transform through divine inspiration, or were these accounts metaphorical, describing a psychological state rather than a supernatural one? And if berserkers did exist in some form, what might explain their extraordinary behaviour on the battlefield? A lone archaeologist brushes dirt from a curious amulet, a tiny gold figure contorted in rage, mouth open in a silent scream. Is this a berserker captured in metal, or merely another warrior from the Norse pantheon? The frustrating truth about berserkers is that while their legend looms large, their physical traces remain elusive, like footprints washed away by the tides of time. If berserkers were as prominent in Viking society as the sagas suggest, we might expect to find substantial archaeological evidence of their existence. Yet the material record is frustratingly sparse and ambiguous, leaving researchers to piece together a picture from scattered fragments. Among the most tantalising potential evidence are the so-called berserker amulets, or figurines. The Torslunda plates from Sweden, dating to the 6th to 7th centuries CE, show helmeted figures alongside warriors wearing what appear to be animal skins, some carrying spears and appearing to dance. One famous plate depicts a warrior in what might be a wolf skin, alongside a figure in a horned helmet, possibly representing Odin. Similar imagery appears on the Vendel era, helmet plates from Sweden, and the slightly later Sutton Hoo helmet from England. These depict warriors in procession, some wearing animal skins or masks. While compelling, these predate the Viking Age proper, which traditionally begins with the Lindisfarne raid in 793 CE, and may represent religious ceremonies rather than berserkers specifically. Other potential archaeological evidence includes the Lewis chessmen. Among these famous 12th century Norse chess pieces discovered in Scotland is a rook piece biting his shield, reminiscent of the shield-biting berserkers described in sagas. The bear warrior from Björkö. This small bronze figurine from Sweden shows a warrior in what might be a bearskin, though its interpretation remains contested. Pictorial stones. Some Gotland picture stones show warriors in possible animal disguises, though these may represent mythological scenes rather than historical berserkers. The archaeological record becomes even more ambiguous when we search for physical evidence of berserker behaviour. If berserkers fought without armour, as the sagas suggest, their remains would be indistinguishable from other unarmoured warriors. Some researchers have suggested that certain Viking Age burials, containing individuals with numerous healed wounds, might represent berserkers, but such evidence is circumstantial at best. Neil Price, a leading archaeologist specialising in Viking Age warfare, has noted the berserkers and úlfheðnar, wolf warriors, appear prominently in the written sources, but they are very hard to find archaeologically. We can see warriors and the equipment of war, but the special attributes of these particular fighters leave little trace in the ground. This absence of definitive archaeological evidence has led some scholars to suggest that berserkers may have been primarily literary constructs, exaggerations or inventions of saga writers working centuries after the Viking Age. Others argue that berserkers existed, but that their special status was behavioural and psychological, rather than material, leaving little distinctive trace in the archaeological record. The debate is complicated by the time gap between the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 CE, and the writing of the sagas, mostly 13th to 14th centuries. By the time the sagas were recorded, Christianity had replaced Norse paganism, and the writers may have been describing practices they had never personally witnessed, relying instead on oral tradition and older poems. However, the persistence of berserker imagery across multiple sources and its consistency with broader Indo-European warrior traditions suggests there may be a historical kernel to these accounts. As archaeologist Leszek Gardewa has argued, even if the sagas exaggerate the abilities of berserkers, they were likely inspired by real warrior practices and beliefs. The archaeological evidence, while inconclusive, does confirm certain elements of Viking Age warrior culture that align with berserker descriptions. We know that animal symbolism was important in Norse warfare, that elite warriors existed who might have had special status, and that religious rituals were connected to battle preparation. Whether these elements combine to create warriors recognisable as the berserkers of saga literature remains an open question, one that the archaeological record alone cannot definitively answer. A one-eyed figure sits enthroned in shadow, ravens perched on his shoulders. Around him, spectral warriors raise horns of mead in Valhalla's gleaming hall. But the Allfather's gifts always come with a price. Did Odin's blessing transform men into unstoppable warriors, or did it consume them from within, burning them like candles lit at both ends? To understand berserkers fully, we must place them within the context of Norse religion and cosmology. Their connection to Odin, the chief of the Aesir gods, is fundamental to their mythological identity and provides crucial insight into how Vikings might have understood berserker behaviour. Odin, also known as Woden, Wotan, or Odin, was a complex deity associated with wisdom, poetry, death, magic, and war. Unlike Thor, who represented the straightforward aspects of combat, Odin embodied war's more mysterious, ecstatic, and terrifying dimensions. His name derives from Odiar, meaning fury, excitement, or inspiration, a divine frenzy that could manifest as poetic genius or battle madness. In the mythology, Odin sacrificed himself to himself, hanging for 9 days from Yggdrasil, the world tree, to gain knowledge of the runes. This self-sacrifice exemplifies his association with transcending normal boundaries through suffering. As the psychopomp who conducted fallen warriors to Valhalla, he had dominion over death and the afterlife, particularly for those who died violently in battle. Several pieces of evidence link berserkers specifically to Odin worship. In Ynglinga saga, Snorri Sturluson explicitly states that berserkers were Odin's men who fought without armour. The animal associations of berserkers, bears and wolves, connect to Odin's own animal companions. He was attended by wolves named Geri and Freki, the ravenous and the greedy, and ravens named Hugin and Munin, thought and memory. Odin was known by many names, including Berserk Jagud, god of berserkers, and Herjan, leader of armies. The concept of divine possession was well established in Norse culture. Gods could enter their human devotees, granting them extraordinary abilities while temporarily supplanting their normal consciousness. For berserkers, this divine madness would have been understood not as mental illness, but as a sacred state, a terrible gift from Odin that marked them as special. The 9th century skaldic poem Haraldskvæði describes berserkers as úlfheðnar, wolfcoats, who redden their spear points in battle, explicitly connecting them to Odin. The berserkers bellowed as the battle began, the wolfcoats howled and shook their weapons. This suggests a ritualised performance of animal identity that would have had deep religious significance. Berserkers' apparent immunity to pain and wounds would have been understood within this religious framework. Rather than a physical phenomenon, it represented the warrior spirit temporarily leaving the mortal realm, becoming like Odin, transcendent of physical limitations. The subsequent exhaustion after battle frenzy could be interpreted as the god departing from the warrior's body, leaving him depleted. This religious dimension helps explain why berserkers were both feared and respected in Norse society. As channels for divine power, They were sacred in a way that ordinary warriors were not. Yet this same connection made them dangerous and unpredictable, like the god they served. Terry Gunnell, professor of folkloristics at the University of Iceland, suggests that berserkers might have been part of an initiatory warrior cult dedicated to Odin, similar to other Indo-European male warrior societies. These cults often involved ritualised transformation, sometimes through the use of animal disguises, to access supernatural power. The religious understanding of berserkers began to change with the Christianisation of Scandinavia. As Norse paganism gave way to Christianity between the 10th and 12th centuries, the divine explanation for berserker behaviour was gradually replaced by more negative interpretations. What had once been seen as divine possession became demonic influence, or simple madness. By the time the sagas were written down in Christian Iceland, berserkers were increasingly portrayed as antisocial figures rather than honoured warriors. This transformation reflects the changing religious landscape and offers a reminder that our written sources view berserkers through a lens already influenced by Christian morality. Whether berserkers truly believed themselves possessed by Odin, or whether this was a cultural framework that helped explain and channel intense psychological states, remains an open question. What's clear is that the religious dimension of berserker behaviour cannot be separated from its psychological and social aspects. All were interwoven in the Norse understanding of these extraordinary warriors. Two warriors sit silently by a smoky hearth. One, a grizzled veteran, stares into the flames, flinching at each pop and crackle. The younger man watches, concerned. "You were like a different man in the battle yesterday," he finally says. "I couldn't reach you." The older warrior doesn't look up. "I wasn't there," he whispers. "I was back in the shield wall at Ashdown, watching my brothers fall." Could the legendary fury of berserkers be the mind's desperate attempt to survive the unsurvivable? The modern understanding of psychological trauma offers compelling new perspectives on berserker behaviour. While we must be cautious about retroactively diagnosing historical figures with contemporary psychological concepts, the parallels between berserker behaviour and what we now recognise as combat trauma are striking and worthy of exploration. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was formally recognised as a diagnosis in 1980, but the psychological impact of warfare has been documented throughout history. From soldier's heart in the American Civil War to shell shock in World War I and combat fatigue in World War II, the symptoms have remained remarkably consistent across cultures and eras. Core symptoms of combat-related PTSD include hyperarousal, heightened alertness, exaggerated startle response, and difficulty relaxing, intrusive memories, flashbacks and nightmares about traumatic events, avoidance, emotional numbing and avoidance of trauma reminders, negative alterations in cognition and mood, including distorted beliefs about oneself or others, dissociation, feeling detached from oneself or one's surroundings. Several of these symptoms align with berserker descriptions in the sagas. The berserker's transformation before battle, trembling, facial contortions, altered vocalization, resembles the physiological arousal seen in acute stress responses. Their apparent immunity to pain suggests dissociation, a psychological mechanism that can protect individuals during overwhelming trauma by creating a sense of detachment from one's body. Jonathan Shea, a psychiatrist who worked extensively with Vietnam veterans, proposed in his influential book, Achilles in Vietnam, that many ancient warrior descriptions, including berserkers, might represent combat trauma. He identified a state he called berserk rage among veterans, a combat fury characterised by bloodlust, disconnection from human restraints, and psychological compartmentalisation. Shea writes, "Berserk rage is prepared for by the betrayal of what's right, and the shrinkage of the social and moral horizon down to the man next to you. Combat trauma destroys the capacity for social trust, and berserking burns away the social inhibitions against killing." The Viking Age was extraordinarily violent, even by the standards of early medieval Europe. young men would have witnessed and participated in brutal raids and battles from adolescence onward. The psychological impact of such experiences, seeing friends dismembered, participating in the slaughter of civilians during raids, enduring the terror of shield wall combat, would have been profound. Without modern psychological frameworks to process these experiences, Norse culture may have channeled trauma responses into culturally sanctioned roles like the berserker. What we might now identify as symptoms of psychological injury could have been interpreted as divine inspiration or special warrior prowess. The saga descriptions of post-battle exhaustion among berserkers align with what modern clinicians recognise as the aftermath of extreme sympathetic nervous system activation. After the body's fight-or-flight response subsides, a crash often follows, characterised by profound fatigue and vulnerability, precisely what the sagas describe happening to berserkers after their fury abated. Particularly interesting is the berserkers' social position in Norse society. In the sagas, they often appear as outsiders, men who don't quite fit into normal social structures. This parallels the social isolation frequently experienced by combat veterans with PTSD, who may struggle to reintegrate into civilian society. Some scholars have proposed that berserkers might represent an early cultural accommodation for combat trauma, a socially sanctioned role for warriors whose psychological injuries made them both especially dangerous in battle and difficult to integrate into peaceful society. By framing their condition as a gift from Odin rather than an injury, Norse culture could have provided these men with status and purpose. However, we must be careful not to simply relabel a complex cultural phenomenon with modern diagnostic categories. Berserkers existed within a specific religious and social context that shaped how their behaviour was understood and expressed. What we might identify as symptoms, they likely experienced as transformation or divine possession. Neil Price cautions, "We should be wary of imposing our own categories on the past. The berserker was not simply a traumatised veteran in modern terms, but someone operating within a completely different understanding of the relationship between humans, gods and battle." Nevertheless, the PTSD lens offers valuable insights into how extreme combat experiences might have shaped berserker behaviour, regardless of how that behaviour was culturally interpreted. It reminds us that behind the myths and legends were real human beings grappling with the psychological consequences of violence in ways that continue to resonate with warriors today. The shaman holds a wooden bowl containing a murky liquid. Steam rises from its surface, carrying a pungent odour. Around him, warriors wait in silence. "Drink," he commands, "and Odin will enter your blood." One by one, the men take the bowl, knowing that what follows will be both transcendence and terror. Did chemical courage fuel the berserker's legendary fury, or is this merely another attempt to explain the inexplicable? One of the most persistent theories about berserkers suggests their battle frenzy may have been induced or enhanced by psychoactive substances. While direct evidence is scarce, circumstantial evidence and cross-cultural comparisons make this hypothesis worthy of serious consideration. Several candidates have been proposed as potential berserker intoxicants. Amanita muscaria, Flea garrick. This distinctive red and white mushroom contains muscimol and ibotenic acid, which can produce alterations in consciousness, including euphoria, sensory enhancement, and in some cases increased aggression. It has documented ritual use in Siberian shamanism. Hyoscyamus niger, henbane, a plant in the nightshade family containing tropane alkaloids that can produce hallucinations, increased heart rate, and a feeling of flight. It was known in Norse contexts and appears in later medieval sources. Alcohol. While less exotic than other candidates, strong alcohol could have contributed to reduced pain sensitivity and lowered inhibitions. Bog myrtle, Myrica gale. Used in Nordic beer brewing, it has mild psychoactive properties when consumed in quantity. The ethnobotanist Kevin Feeney has argued that Amanita muscaria is the most likely candidate, pointing to linguistic connections between berserkers and bears. noting that bears are known to consume these mushrooms in the wild. The mushroom's effects, including increased strength, altered perception, and reduced sensitivity to pain, align with berserker descriptions. Other researchers point to henbane as a more likely candidate. The ethnobotanist Karsten Vater suggests that henbane's effects, which can include a feeling of flying, increased aggression, and reduced pain sensitivity, better match berserker behaviour. Henbane was certainly known in the Norse world and appears in later medieval texts about witchcraft. Archaeological evidence provides some tentative support for the substance theory. A pouch found at Gorsdorf, Germany, in a 10th century grave, contained cannabis and henbane seeds, suggesting these substances were known and potentially used in a ritual context during the Viking Age. However, no definitive evidence directly links such substances to berserkers specifically. The saga literature itself is silent on drug use among berserkers. This absence is notable, but not conclusive. Saga writers working centuries after the Viking Age, and in a Christian context, might have omitted such details either from ignorance or to avoid glorifying pagan practices. Some scholars have suggested that, if substances were used, they would likely have been employed within a ritual framework rather than as simple intoxicants. Rudolf Simek, a leading scholar of Norse mythology, proposes that any substance use would have been part of a complex religious ceremony invoking Odin, not merely a practical means to enhance fighting ability. Cross-cultural comparisons provide additional context. Many warrior cultures worldwide have used psychoactive substances in ritual contexts related to warfare. The Berawan people of Borneo used plant intoxicants before headhunting raids. Aztec jaguar warriors consumed psychoactive substances before battle. Some Native American warriors used jimson weed, another tropane alkaloid-containing plant, in warrior rituals. The ancient Scythians, according to Herodotus, used cannabis in warrior rituals. These parallels suggest that if berserkers did use psychoactive substances, they would not have been unique in doing so. However, it's important to note that, in most of these cultures, substance use was embedded within religious ritual rather than being simply a tactical advantage. Critics of the substance theory point out several limitations. Most psychoactive substances would impair coordination and tactical judgment, potentially making warriors less rather than more effective. The logistics of timing the consumption of substances for maximum effect during unpredictable battle conditions would be challenging. The consistent descriptions of berserkers across sources suggest a standardized behavior pattern that might be difficult to achieve through substances with variable effects. A more nuanced view suggests that while substances might have played a role in some berserker practices, they were likely part of a broader complex of techniques, including ritualized movement, chanting, hyperventilation, sleep deprivation, and psychological conditioning. Rather than seeing substances as the primary cause of berserker behavior, they might better be understood as one potential element in a multifaceted approach to altering consciousness for warfare. As with many aspects of berserker lore, definitive answers remain elusive. Without direct archaeological evidence of substance use specifically connected to berserkers, the theory remains speculative, though plausible. What seems most likely is that if substances were used, they would have been integrated into a comprehensive religious and psychological framework rather than being the sole explanation for berserker phenomena. 12 men stand in a moonlit clearing, their faces painted black, their shoulders draped with wolf pelts. They move in unison, circling a central fire, their chanting building to a crescendo. These are not merely warriors training for battle, they are brothers being reborn as something more than human. Did berserkers form an elite brotherhood with secret initiations and sacred bonds, or were they simply men with a particular temperament drawn to a specific battle style? Beyond individual warriors experiencing battle frenzy, evidence suggests berserkers may have constituted organised warrior bands or cultic brotherhoods with specific initiation rites, shared practices, and a distinct social identity within Viking society. Several historical sources support this interpretation. In Heimskringla, Snorri Sturluson describes how King Harald Fairhair had in his service a group of berserkers called úlfheðnar, wolfcoats, who served as his elite guard. Wolfcoats they were called, for they wore wolf skins over their mail and defended the prow of the king's ship. No iron could wound them. This account suggests berserkers functioned as organised units rather than as isolated individuals. Similarly, the Vatnsdæla saga mentions berserkers travelling in groups of 12, a number with potential ritual significance in Norse culture. The organised nature of berserker groups finds parallels in other Indo-European warrior bands, suggesting a common cultural heritage. Comparable examples include the Germanic Mannabünder, men's bands, described by Tacitus, the Gallic Gesatai, who fought naked in battle, the Irish Fianna, warrior bands living outside normal society, the Roman Juventus, young men's warrior associations. Archaeologist Chris Kershaw, in her work The One-Eyed God, Odin and the Indo-Germanic Mannabünder, argues that berserkers represented the Norse manifestation of an ancient Indo-European institution of ecstatic warrior brotherhoods dedicated to specific deities, in this case Odin. These warrior bands typically shared several characteristics: initiatory structure, young men underwent rituals to join the group, animal symbolism, members identified with predator animals, liminality, the groups existed at the boundaries of society, religious dedication, members were consecrated to specific war deities, shared ecstatic practices. The groups employed techniques to induce altered states. Evidence for berserker initiation rituals is limited but suggestive. In Hrolf's saga Kraka, a character becomes a berserker after drinking from a special vessel, possibly indicating a ritual induction. The saga also describes berserkers living together as a band with their own internal hierarchy. The animal associations of berserkers, bears and wolves, likely had totemic significance beyond mere symbolism. By ritually becoming these animals, warriors may have believed they acquired their strength and ferocity. The bear and wolf were not chosen arbitrarily. Both represented powerful predators that featured prominently in Norse cosmology, with wolves particularly associated with Odin. Archaeological evidence from the migration period and Viking Age Scandinavia shows warriors were sometimes buried with bear claws or skins, suggesting a special connection between certain warriors and these animals. The Torslunda plates mentioned earlier show figures in what appear to be ritual dances wearing animal skins, possibly depicting initiation ceremonies. If berserkers did constitute a formal warrior cult, they would have occupied a complex position in Norse society, simultaneously revered for their battle prowess and feared for their volatility. This ambivalence appears in the sagas, where berserkers are portrayed as both valuable elite warriors and dangerous disruptive forces. By the late Viking Age, the social position of berserkers appears to have declined. The Gragars, Iceland's medieval law code, explicitly outlawed berserker behaviour, with going berserk punishable by lesser outlawry, temporary exile. This legal prohibition suggests that by the 12th to 13th centuries, berserker practices were viewed as socially disruptive rather than valuable. This changing perception may reflect the transition from a society organised around raiding and warfare to more settled agricultural communities where uncontrolled violence threatened social stability. It also coincides with Christianization, which would have viewed ecstatic pagan warrior cults with suspicion. If berserkers were indeed an organised warrior cult, their practices would likely have included initiation rituals marking the transition from ordinary warrior to berserker, shared secret knowledge about techniques for inducing battle frenzy, distinctive appearance, animal skins, specific hairstyles or tattoos, ritual preparation before battle, possibly including chanting, dancing or substance use, special relationship with religious specialists like skalds or seers. Understanding berserkers as a formal warrior cult helps explain their consistent portrayal across various sources and their special status in Norse society. Rather than simply being warriors who occasionally lost control, they may have been men who underwent specific training and initiation to transform themselves into living weapons, human embodiments of Odin's battle fury. The Saxon soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, spears bristling forward, a disciplined wall of steel and wood. Then they hear it, a howling that sounds more beast than human. Through the morning mist, they see them coming, wild-eyed men, half naked despite the cold, biting their shields like rabid dogs. Some Saxon warriors break formation and run before the first blow lands. Was the berserker's greatest weapon not his axe, but the primal fear he inspired in his enemies? Beyond their individual fighting capabilities, berserkers served a crucial strategic function on Viking battlefields. They were living weapons of psychological warfare. Their terrifying appearance and behaviour could break enemy morale before physical combat even began. A tactical advantage well understood by Viking commanders. Fear is a powerful force in combat. When confronted with something that triggers primal terror, even trained warriors can experience physiological responses that impair fighting ability. Tunnel vision, loss of fine motor control, cognitive impairment, and the overwhelming urge to flee. By presenting themselves as something beyond human, as embodiments of animal fury or divine wrath, berserkers exploited these psychological vulnerabilities. Several elements of berserker presentation were particularly effective at triggering fear responses, violation of normal human behaviour. By howling, foaming at the mouth and biting their shields, berserkers signalled that they operated outside normal human constraints. Unpredictability. Their apparent immunity to pain and disregard for self-preservation made their actions unpredictable, increasing the anxiety of opponents. Dehumanization. By taking on animal characteristics, berserkers became other, creatures not bound by human limitations or moral constraints. Religious terror. In a world where divine forces were believed to directly influence battles, berserkers' association with Odin added supernatural dread to their already frightening presence. The effectiveness of such psychological tactics is attested in historical accounts. In Egil's saga, we read how berserkers would sometimes be positioned at the front of Viking formations, their presence alone causing disarray in enemy ranks. Similar accounts appear in non-Norse sources describing encounters with Viking forces. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, describing Viking raids, notes how the mere appearance of Norse warriors could cause panic, suggesting their fearsome reputation preceded them. While not specifically mentioning berserkers, these accounts align with the psychological impact berserkers were designed to create. This strategic use of terror has parallels in other warrior cultures. The Celtic warriors who fought naked against Roman legions, the Zulu warriors whose distinctive appearance and battle cries unnerved British troops, and the Japanese samurai whose elaborate armour was designed partly to intimidate. All understood that affecting the enemy's mind was as important as attacking his body. Viking military leaders appear to have deployed berserkers tactically to maximise this psychological impact. In Heimskringla, King Harald Fairhair's berserkers are described as defending the prow of his ship, the most visible position and the first point of contact with enemies. This placement suggests a deliberate strategy to showcase these terrifying warriors where they would have the greatest psychological effect. The practical value of such psychological warfare was considerable in the context of early medieval combat. Battles were often decided by which side broke formation first, and causing even a momentary hesitation or disruption in enemy ranks could create exploitable weaknesses. A small number of berserkers might thus have an impact disproportionate to their actual fighting ability by creating openings for conventional warriors to exploit. Some scholars suggest that the berserker's fearsome reputation may have been deliberately cultivated and exaggerated by Vikings themselves as part of a broader strategy of intimidation. The sagas were compiled long after the Viking Age, but they likely preserved and perhaps enhanced stories that Vikings themselves had used to build their fearsome reputation. This perspective helps explain why berserkers feature so prominently in Norse literature, despite potentially being a relatively small subset of Viking warriors. Their value was not merely in how many enemies they could personally kill, but in the terror they inspired and the psychological advantage this gave to Viking forces as a whole. Understanding berserkers as instruments of psychological warfare adds an important dimension to our analysis. Beyond questions of individual psychology or religious experience, berserkers served a practical military function. Their extreme behaviour, whether induced by training, substances, psychological conditioning, or some combination of factors, was harnessed as a strategic asset in the Viking way of war. This strategic dimension also helps explain why similar warrior types appear across many cultures. The psychological principles that make such warriors effective transcend cultural boundaries, leading different societies to independently develop their own versions of the terror-inducing warrior who seems more than human on the battlefield. A respected chieftain sits in judgment at the thing, his measured words bringing peace to a land dispute. None would guess that this same man, days earlier, had torn through an enemy shield wall like a demon, heedless of the spears that pierced his flesh. The sagas tell of berserkers who could summon their fury at will, but also of those consumed by it, unable to distinguish friend from foe. What happens when the beast awakened for battle refuses to be caged again? One of the most fascinating aspects of berserker lore is the tension between control and chaos. The sagas present a complex picture of berserkers' ability, or inability, to manage their battle fury, raising profound questions about agency, identity, and the psychological cost of becoming a living weapon. In some saga accounts, berserkers appear capable of summoning and dismissing their battle rage at will. In Egil's saga, the protagonist's father, Skallagrim, could enter a berserker state when needed in battle but return to normal afterward. This controlled transformation is presented as a valuable skill, allowing the warrior to access extraordinary abilities without being dominated by them. However, other narratives portray berserkers as dangerously unstable, their fury erupting unpredictably and sometimes turning against allies. The Eyjabygja saga tells of a berserker who accidentally kills his own foster son while in a battle rage. In Grettir's saga, berserkers are described as becoming so wild that they attack rocks and trees when no enemies remain. This duality reflects a fundamental question about berserker nature. Was the berserker state something a warrior controlled, or something that controlled the warrior? The Norse term berserksganga, berserker going, suggests a process of transformation or journey, implying the warrior entered a different state of being. This concept aligns with what anthropologists call liminal states, conditions between normal categories of existence, where usual rules and constraints are suspended. Several patterns emerge from saga descriptions of berserkers' relationship with their fury. The onset of fury often followed a recognisable pattern. Trembling, facial contortions and vocalizations preceded the full berserker state, suggesting a progression rather than an instantaneous change. Environmental triggers could spark unintended transformations. In several sagas, berserkers lose control when provoked or exposed to specific stimuli, like the sight of blood or the heat of a fire. The berserker state was temporary. After their fury abated, berserkers experienced significant weakness, suggesting the state was physiologically unsustainable. Experience seemed to affect control. Younger or newer berserkers are often portrayed as less able to manage their fury than veterans. These patterns suggest that while the berserker state might begin as an overwhelming experience, warriors could potentially learn to navigate it with greater control over time. This progression would parallel other intensive training processes, where practitioners gradually master techniques that initially overwhelm them. The psychological concept of dissociation offers a useful framework for understanding this dynamic. Dissociation involves a disconnection between thoughts, surroundings, actions, and identity, a splitting of consciousness that can occur during extreme stress. Modern combat veterans sometimes report dissociative states during battle, experiencing a sense of detachment from their actions or feeling that someone else is controlling their body. For berserkers, this dissociative state may have been deliberately cultivated rather than avoided, creating a battle persona separate from everyday identity. This would explain the descriptions of berserkers as not themselves during their fury. They were accessing an alternate state of consciousness with different behavioural patterns and capabilities. The struggle to control this alternate state appears as a central theme in berserker narratives. In Egil's saga, the protagonist inherits his father's berserker tendencies, but struggles with them more, suggesting a generational decline in the ability to manage this condition. This may reflect changing Norse attitudes toward berserkers over time, as their uncontrolled violence became less compatible with an increasingly ordered society. By the later saga age, berserkers who cannot control their fury are consistently portrayed negatively, while those who maintain mastery over it may still be respected. This suggests a cultural ideal of controlled power, strength harnessed by will rather than wild force that endangers the social order. The post-battle exhaustion described in the sagas has psychological parallels as well. Modern understanding of acute stress responses recognises that intense sympathetic nervous system activation, the fight or flight response, is typically followed by a parasympathetic rebound, causing fatigue and vulnerability. What the sagas describe as a mysterious weakness following berserker fury aligns with this well-documented physiological pattern. Some saga berserkers are described as being shape-strong, hamramra, a concept related to the Norse belief in hamingja, luck or personal power, and the ability to project one's spirit in animal form. This connection between berserkers and shape-shifting further emphasises the liminality of their condition. They existed at the boundary between human and animal, controlled and uncontrolled, individual and other. The berserker's struggle with control serves as a powerful metaphor for broader human experiences of rage, trauma, and the potential for violence that exists within everyone. Perhaps this is why the berserker archetype continues to resonate in modern culture. It represents both the terrifying and empowering aspects of accessing states beyond normal human limitations. Dawn breaks over the battlefield. Among the dead and wounded, a berserker sits alone, staring at nothing. His wounds are many, but seemingly unfelt. Hours earlier, he had moved like lightning, striking down foes with supernatural strength. Now he can barely lift his waterskin to his lips. His companions know not to approach him yet. The return journey from Odin's embrace is a lonely path, and those who walk it must find their own way back to the world of men. The sagas consistently describe a period of profound vulnerability following berserker episodes. This aftermath provides crucial insights into the nature of the berserker state and its costs to those who experienced it. According to multiple saga accounts, after their battle fury subsided, berserkers entered a state of extreme weakness, lasting from several hours to several days. During this period, they exhibited physical exhaustion, unable to defend themselves or sometimes even move without assistance, emotional numbness or detachment, described as being not fully present. Vulnerability to attack. Several saga accounts mention berserkers being killed during this recovery phase. Memory gaps. Some descriptions suggest berserkers had limited recall of their actions during their fury. In Egil's saga, after a berserker episode, the protagonist is described as being so exhausted that he lay in bed for days. The Ynglinga saga notes that after berserkers' fury abated, they became weak and feeble, and all their strength left them. This pattern bears striking similarities to what modern clinicians recognise as the aftermath of extreme stress responses. When the body activates its sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, for extended periods or with unusual intensity, the subsequent parasympathetic rebound, rest and digest, can be equally extreme, causing profound fatigue, cognitive difficulties, and emotional numbing. From a physiological perspective, several mechanisms might explain this post-berserker state. Adrenal exhaustion, prolonged production of adrenaline and other stress hormones, can deplete the body's resources, leading to a crash when these chemicals are metabolized. Accumulated physical damage. The pain-dampening effects of combat stress can mask injuries that become apparent only after the stress response subsides. Metabolic depletion. Intense physical exertion rapidly consumes the body's glucose and glycogen stores, leading to profound fatigue once these resources are exhausted. Nervous system recalibration. After extreme arousal, the nervous system requires time to return to baseline functioning. The psychological dimensions of this aftermath may have been equally significant. Modern combat veterans often report a period of emotional numbness or dissociation following intense combat, a psychological buffer that prevents immediate processing of traumatic experiences but can lead to difficulties reintegrating into normal social contexts. For berserkers, this recovery period would have represented a dangerous transition between states, a return journey from divine possession or animal embodiment to ordinary human consciousness. The vulnerability during this phase may explain why berserkers typically operated in groups or with protective companions who could defend them during recovery. The saga literature suggests that, over time, repeated berserker episodes could take a cumulative toll. Older berserkers are sometimes described as physically diminished or psychologically unstable, suggesting that whatever process enabled their battle fury also exacted a long-term cost. This pattern aligns with modern understanding of the effects of repeated trauma exposure and extreme stress responses. Studies of combat veterans show that repeated activation of emergency stress responses can lead to dysregulation of these systems over time, contributing to chronic health problems and psychological difficulties. The aftermath of berserker episodes also had social dimensions. Several sagas mention the shame or regret berserkers sometimes experienced upon learning what they had done while in their fury, particularly if they had harmed allies or innocents. This suggests that despite the cultural and religious framework that legitimised berserker behaviour, the psychological reality of losing control remained troubling. In Vatnsdæla saga, a character named Thorir becomes a berserker against his will through a curse. After his episodes, he is described as being deeply distressed by his actions and seeking to be freed from his condition. This narrative suggests an understanding that the berserker state, while valuable in certain contexts, could also be experienced as an affliction rather than a gift. The vulnerability of the post-berserker state may have contributed to their declining status in later Norse society. As warfare became more organised and predictable, warriors who became temporarily incapacitated after battle would represent a tactical liability rather than an asset, regardless of their effectiveness during combat itself. This aspect of berserker lore offers perhaps the most poignant window into their humanity. Behind the terrifying battle fury and superhuman feats lay ordinary men who paid an extraordinary price for their abilities. The saga's unflinching portrayal of this aftermath suggests that even in a culture that glorified warfare, there was recognition of its profound cost to the warrior's body and mind. A Marine sits in a therapist's office, describing the moment his convoy was ambushed in Fallujah. "I don't remember much after the first explosion," he says. "My buddies told me I pulled 2 men from the burning Humvee, though I was bleeding pretty bad myself. They said I was screaming the whole time, but I don't remember that." The therapist nods. "It's called acute stress response," she explains. "But is it so different from what the Norse would have called berserksganga, the berserker's way?" The berserker phenomenon resonates across centuries, finding parallels in modern warfare, psychology, and cultural understanding. As we conclude our exploration, we must consider how these ancient warriors continue to inform our understanding of combat psychology, the impact of trauma, and the human capacity for both extraordinary achievement and profound suffering. Modern military history provides numerous accounts of soldiers exhibiting berserker-like behaviour in combat. During World War II, Medal of Honor recipient Audie Murphy mounted a burning tank destroyer and used its machine gun to hold off an entire company of German infantry, later reporting that he felt a strange detachment during the incident. In Vietnam, soldiers occasionally reported entering states of dissociative fury, where they performed actions they could barely remember afterward. These modern parallels suggest that the berserker phenomenon may represent not just a culturally specific Norse practice, but a more universal human capacity that emerges under extreme combat conditions. What distinguished berserkers from these modern examples was not necessarily the psychological state itself, but the cultural framework that interpreted, ritualized, and deliberately induced it. Contemporary combat psychology recognizes several states that share characteristics with berserker descriptions. Combat flow, an optimal performance state where actions become automatic and time perception alters. Tonic immobility, a freezing response that can sometimes transition into explosive action. Peritraumatic dissociation, detachment from one's surroundings or sense of self during trauma. Acute stress response, the body's emergency reaction to perceived life threats. Each of these states involves alterations in normal consciousness that can produce exceptional performance while potentially exacting long-term costs, a trade-off that seems central to the berserker experience as well. Beyond military context, the berserker archetype has permeated modern culture. From comic book superheroes who transform into something more than human, to sports psychology's concept of the zone, to fictional characters who access primal rage for strength, the basic pattern of the berserker continues to fascinate us. This enduring appeal suggests the berserker represents something fundamental about human psychology, the potential for transformation through intensity, and the double-edged nature of such transformation. The modern understanding of trauma also offers new perspectives on berserkers. Contemporary trauma theory recognizes that traumatic experiences can fundamentally alter a person's psychology, creating new patterns of response that may be adaptive in dangerous environments but problematic in safe ones. This framework helps explain the berserkers' difficulty reintegrating into peaceful society. They had adapted too thoroughly to the extremes of combat. Neurobiological research provides additional insights. Studies show that repeated exposure to extreme stress can create lasting changes in brain structure and function, particularly in areas related to threat detection, emotional regulation, and impulse control. These changes can produce individuals who are hyper-responsive to threat cues and primed for aggressive action, a pattern that aligns with saga descriptions of berserkers being easily provoked into fury. The concept of moral injury, psychological damage resulting from actions that violate one's core moral beliefs, may also be relevant to understanding berserkers. Warriors who committed extreme acts of violence, even within culturally sanctioned contexts, might still experience psychological consequences from these actions. The berserker's fury could have provided temporary psychological insulation from these moral implications, but the aftermath might have included reckoning with what they had done. From a therapeutic perspective, the berserker phenomenon raises important questions about how societies integrate warriors after combat. Norse culture provided berserkers with a religious framework that gave meaning to their experiences and a social role that channeled their abilities. As these cultural structures disappeared with Christianization, berserkers lost their place in society, a pattern that parallels the challenges modern veterans sometimes face when returning to civilian life. Perhaps most significantly, berserkers remind us that the psychological impact of warfare is not unique to our era. While we now have scientific language and therapeutic approaches to address combat trauma, the fundamental human experience of being transformed by extreme violence has remained remarkably consistent across millennia. Were berserkers fearless warriors, blessed by Odin, or men scarred by the psychological wounds of constant warfare? The evidence suggests they were both, and that this duality was understood, at least intuitively, by the Norse themselves. The sagas portray berserkers with ambivalence, recognizing both their value in battle and the danger they pose to social order, both their divine inspiration and their human vulnerability. This nuanced view offers wisdom for our own understanding of warriors and warfare. Rather than seeing combat stress reactions as either purely pathological, as some modern medical models suggest, or purely heroic, as some cultural narratives imply, the berserker tradition acknowledges both the power and the cost of accessing extreme states in battle. In the end, berserkers stand at the intersection of mythology and psychology, religion and neurobiology, cultural practice and universal human experience. Their story is not merely a historical curiosity, but a window into enduring questions about the limits of human capacity, the nature of transformation, and the price of power that remains as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago on the blood-soaked fields of the Viking Age. The berserker's gift was also his curse. On the battlefield he was more than a man, a storm, a living weapon no shield could withstand. But when the silence fell, he was left with the wreckage of his own mind. Some called it divine fury, others madness. Today we might call it trauma. So I'll leave you with this. Were the berserkers fearless heroes to admire, or broken men destroyed by battles that never ended? In truth, the battlefield ended, but for the berserker, the war never did.